Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Martin. I'm one of the moderators of the GBV AOR Community of Practice, and I'm going to be the chair of the webinar today. We'd like to thank you all for joining us for this exciting webinar on one of our guiding principles for all GBV and emergencies work. We're going to be focusing on the survivor-centered approach today. Next slide, please. First, a few words for those of you who may not know who the GBV AOR Community of Practice is. So we are a virtual community of over 1,100 GBV specialists from all over the world. The Community of Practice is a platform for both learners and experienced specialists so that they can discuss challenges and troubleshoot solutions to their work. We provide a place for our members to get support from their peers, to share new resources, to brainstorm solutions, and to talk about the different challenges that they face doing their work. We also bring together specialists to address key topics in gender-based violence, like this webinar that we're having today, where we're going to be discussing the survivor-centered approach in the multi-sectoral response. Just a reminder that membership in the Community of Practice is for individuals. We welcome anyone who's working in GBV and emergencies to join us. If you're interested in joining the GBV AOR Community of Practice and you're a GBV practitioner, just get in touch with us. You can send us an email or go through the GBV AOR website. And during the webinar, we'll put some information in the chat for you so that you can easily reach out. Okay, next slide, please. So we also work closely with the GBV AOR Help Desk, and the Help Desk is a product that lets members get in touch with a specialist when they need additional support. You can see the information here about the Help Desk, and we'll also put the information in the chat for you there. Okay, next slide. Before we get into the nitty-gritty and the real reason we're all here, just let me do a little bit of housekeeping for us. This webinar will be recorded, and we will share the link with you after the event. You can also find all of our webinar recordings on the GBV AOR YouTube channel, and we'll put that information in the chat for you too, so you can go back and look at different topics that we've discussed in the past. All of the materials, including the PowerPoints, will be shared with you after the event. We'd also like to ask you, if you could, to stay till the end so you can give us some feedback on the webinar. Today, we're very happy that we're able to have English and French interpretation since one of our speakers will be speaking in French today. So please make sure down at the bottom of your screen that you go to the interpretation channel and choose the language that you would like to be listening to today. So we're offering it in French and English. Finally, we really want to hear from you and your experiences and what your thoughts are on this topic. We're hoping to have a nice discussion after you've heard from everyone. So, feel free to use the chat to comment, to ask your questions, anything that you want in there, and we'll be monitoring it so that we can pose your questions to the panel and also let you share your experiences as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let me just briefly introduce our speakers and turn it over to them. So as I mentioned, I'm the chair today. I'm going to be chairing the question and answer session. We have two of the three authors of the article, Who is Centered in the Humanitarian Response to Gender-Based Violence, a Critical Discourse Analysis of the Survivor-Centered Approach, Dr. Chen Rice from the University of Denver and Ilaria Michaelis from Cambridge University. Both of them are Community of Practice members as well, so we're very proud to be hosting them on this webinar. Our other moderator of the COP, Beth Van, is stepping back into her role as a GBV specialist rather than just the moderator this time. And Beth has over 30 years of experience specializing in violence against women and girls in humanitarian emergencies. She's the primary author of many of the early articles, guides, training manuals, and materials that we use in the GBV and emergencies sector. So we've asked her to come in here and to tell us a little bit more about how we started talking about the survivor-centered approach. Then we're very happy to welcome as well Clarice Rebertu-Gurad from the Denis Mukwege Foundation and Miriam Jangala Fall from the Mosuka in Central African Republic, a survivor-led organization. And they're going to be talking to us from the perspective of the survivors and what they're seeing and hearing in the field as well. So together we'll be here together for about 1 hour and 15 minutes today. And first, we'll hear from Hen and Ilari about their findings. If you have a specific question about the article, we'll ask them there. And then Beth will speak. And then we'll hear from Clarice and Miriam. And then we'll open it up for all of us. So without any further ado, I'd like to now turn it over to Hen.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Beth and Sarah, for both inviting us to speak here today about this important topic and also for making all of the practical arrangements with your colleagues so we can do so. So, and we thank those who are in the audience as well for coming and listening to us. We're going to be presenting on our article, which we co-authored with Jane Makepeace. So in this presentation, we're going to briefly outline the development of the survivor-centered approach. Beth will obviously go into it in much more detail. And then we'll explore whether the articulation and the application of the survivor-centered approach within the humanitarian discourse aligns with the stated intent of it, which is to return control to survivors. And we see our goal with this article and with this work, not this one yet. Go back, please. Thank you. We see our goal in this work is speaking to feminist GBV practitioners, and we are seeking to locate this discussion and this conversation within ongoing conversations about localization and decolonization of humanitarian aid. We believe that intersectional feminist humanitarians, GBV practitioners are well placed to contribute to these efforts. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we are situating this in this broader context of localization and decolonization, and also in broader conversations about humanitarian responses to gender-based violence and the survivor-centered approach as a fundamental premise or basis or principle for this work. We know that this work is underfunded. We know that there's insufficient political and organizational support for this work. And we also, recognize that even though there's a lot of discourse around the importance of local organizations leading humanitarian responses, these actors are constantly overlooked by international humanitarian actors. They may feel excluded based on some of the research that's been done. And unable to do their jobs effectively in humanitarian contexts where international actors are present. The humanitarian GBV responses, obviously, especially in the health and protection sectors, are founded on this survivor-centered approach. And what we wanted to do with this research is to really understand what that means and whether it's been evaluated. What we found in our review of the literature between 2010 and 2022 is that there's a dearth of studies focused on the survivor-centered approach in humanitarian settings. We were unable to find any peer-reviewed publications that described how the principles are implemented in practice, right? Or any publications that evaluated their effectiveness, the effectiveness of the survivor-centered approach. So it appears as though these benefits of survivor-centered approaches have been considered self-evident when contrasted with other approaches or previous approaches to how GBV was addressed. And it seems that there's an assumption there that there's no need to critically assess the uses of the survivor-centered approach, its application, or effectiveness. So to fill this gap, what we did was we analyzed humanitarian GBV guidance and academic literature on humanitarian GBV published between 1990 and 2022. And we looked at the most commonly used resources like the minimum standards, the case management guidelines, the ISC guidelines, materials that most of us here who are members of the GBV community of practice or engage with the GBV AOR are familiar with. Next slide, please. So a little bit on the survivor-centered approach. As I mentioned, Beth will go into the historical development more in detail, but what we wanted to kind of highlight is that it originated in domestic violence service provision, but it's now applied much more widely, including in human rights advocacy, in safeguarding work, in education and justice programming, and more. It's rooted in broader feminist liberation struggles and movements that considered violence against women to be a political and social issue rather than a private personal issue. On an individual level, being survivor-centered implies respecting a survivor's knowledge and expertise of her own situation. And I'm going to be using he, she pronouns, but of course, we're applying this to survivors in all their diversity. So on an individual level, being survivor-centered implies respecting a survivor's knowledge and expertise of her own situation, and ensuring that she is able to take control of her own pathway out of violence. This approach aims to return control to survivors after an experience of violence where the abuser is in control, thus interrupting the violent dynamics and supporting survivors to regain agency over their lives. In the humanitarian sector, GBV sector, a strong consensus has emerged starting from the mid-1990s regarding the application of the survivor-centered approach as being fundamental to GBV responses and service provision. While there's no commonly shared definition, there is a surprising consistency in how the principle is understood, discussed, and applied within the humanitarian GBV sector based on our review of the documents. It's important to note here that the survivor-centered approach still faces resistance um, from both within and outside the humanitarian sector, and that advocating for it is an important aspect of the work of humanitarians who work on gender-based violence. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on the current application of the survivor-centered approach in humanitarian work on gender-based violence. In this slide, many of you will recognize a visual representation of how the survivor-centered approach is implemented across humanitarian, across humanitarian guidance documents. In the middle, we have the 4 GBV guiding principles of safety, respect, confidentiality, and non-discrimination. And then on the right, the multi-sectoral response model. And we're now I'm going to hand over to Ilaria to examine this more in depth and to walk us through the next part of the presentation.
Thanks for that, Hen. And I just a little reminder to speak a bit more slowly, everyone, for our interpreters. So thank you.
Thanks, Hen. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to the interpreters and for having us here. I will do my best to go slowly, but I also get anxious about speaking too slowly. So we'll see how it goes. Please feel free to message again if I need to go more slowly. So next slide, please. So as Hen mentioned, I will sort of take you through each of these ways in which the survivor-centered approach has been translated into in the humanitarian GBV sector. The most common way I think we found in documents and also in our experience is seeing the survivor-centered approach, or SCA, translated as the 4 GBV guiding principles. So safety, confidentiality, respect, and non-discrimination. And each of the principles is supposed to have an equal weight, and no principle is meant to be prioritized over the other. However, what we found is that actually hierarchies often do appear in guidance, in trainings, as well as in discussions, with safety being prioritized over the other 3 guiding principles. And you can see that as well in the illustration that we have here on the slide from an ICRC infographic. So what we argue in the article is by creating these 4 separate and distinct principles, the notion of safety is disconnected or delinked from the idea of self-determination. And at the same time, self-determination is translated, and we think this is problematic, into this idea of respecting, no, still the previous slide, please. Can we go back? Thank you. So the idea of self-determination being translated into respect for our survivors' wishes, which we think is problematic. And so when safety and self-determination are delinked or disconnected, safety becomes an objective factor that can be assessed by an external element, an external person, in particular a GBV expert, a caseworker, often using standardized tools. For example, the IPV risk assessment tool, which we find in the interagency GBV case management guidelines. And so when this happens, the service provider, rather than the survivor, is the one who is in control. We wanted to take as an example this quote from the GBV minimum standards that you can see on the slide, which states caseworkers should never mediate between a survivor and a perpetrator, even if a survivor requests this type of intervention, because mediation has the potential to cause more harm to the survivor. And so in the statement, we see safety being explicitly prioritized over the principle of respect. It basically bans practitioners from engaging in mediation, regardless of what a survivor asks for or wants. And we are clear and we're well aware that this is a recommendation rooted in evidence about the risks of mediation processes. But it does undermine the foundational idea of a survivor-centered approach that a survivor knows best. Instead, it claims that GBV experts using the GBV minimum standards have a superior expertise compared to survivors, which is based on a decontextualized risk assessment and evidence primarily collected in the US and in the West. Next slide, please. So the other strategy to translate the survivor-centered approach that we found in humanitarian guidance documents and trainings was the multi-sectoral model that I'm sure you're all familiar with as well. So I won't describe it, but you do have a visual representation here on the slide if needed. And we absolutely recognize the importance of the multi-sectoral model as an advocacy tool, which has been extremely effective, especially in the initial phases of a humanitarian crisis, to ensure that a minimum set of response services are in place and that are receiving resources. Not only that, as Hen mentioned earlier, we recognize that these services are often still not prioritized or sufficiently funded as they are, and that they are life-saving. So again, this is not a critique of the multi-sectoral model in itself, but of how it is used as a sort of translation or substitution for the survivor-centered approach. In our experience, what happens when the multi-sectoral model is used is a standardization of the potential responses provided to survivors when they experience violence, with the 4 areas, so health, psychosocial support, legal and justice support, and safety and security, becoming the only options that are offered to survivors, regardless of their needs and wishes. Again, we see this dynamic reinforced in tools such as the case follow-up form in the interagency GBV case management guidelines. This form requires caseworkers to evaluate progress for an individual survivors using sort of 4 boxes, one for safety, one for healthcare, one for psychosocial support, and one for access to justice. And caseworkers feel pressured in using forms like this one. They feel pressured to push survivors to access services in these 4 areas so that they can demonstrate progress on the form. And so they become what Davies and Lyon have called saleswomen for a particular strategy. So we go from an idea of GBV response as being survivor defined to an idea of it being service defined instead. And so we question whether we can truly claim to be adopting a survivor-centered approach when we are sort of flattening the complexity of individual GBV experiences to this very limited number of predetermined responses across context. Next slide, please. Our third and final area of critique focuses on the what we consider a narrow application of the survivor-centered approach to individual service provision. As we've been discussing so far, within humanitarian GBV response, we mostly talk of a survivor-centered approach when we talk about service provision and the services that a survivor might choose to access. There's very little guidance we found in our analysis and our experience as GBV practitioners ourselves about how to ensure survivors' participation and self-determination in other areas of GBV programming. For example, community or social level interventions, GBV prevention, or community engagement strategies. Research, however, shows that survivors really value this kind of engagement and involvement, and they see that as part of their trauma recovering and their healing processes. We've often heard ourselves, survivors, saying they want to become more involved in the activities of the organizations that help them, either by becoming caseworkers themselves or engaging community mobilization or advocacy activities, but they're rarely supported to do so. And once again, the safety of survivor or protecting them from stigma is often used as an excuse to justify their exclusion from these kind of programs. Again, GBV experts' own understanding of what is safe for survivors becomes more important than what survivors want to do. And I wanted to draw your attention on this quote, just the last sentence for, because I'm conscious of time, from the Global Protection Cluster Media Guidelines for Reporting on GBV, which says survivors' best interest must take precedence over other objectives. Excuse me. Now, we're all aware of the very dangerous and problematic consequences of unscrupulous media representations of survivors, but we do feel quite uncomfortable with the use of language such as best interest, which comes from traditions of patriarchal and paternalistic understandings of women and children as individuals to be protected, rather than a feminist approach to women's self-determination. Next slide. So what we are, I guess, hoping for and opening a door towards, I hope, with our article is to move from what has become the survivor-centered approach in the humanitarian sector to a survivor-led approach. And we quite like this definition of the two, kind of the difference between the two provided by the Safeguarding Research and Support Hub, saying that a survivor-centered approach is about ensuring that prevention and response are non-discriminatory and respect and prioritize the rights, needs, and wishes of survivors, while a survivor-led approach is an approach that equips and empowers survivors to take a leadership role in their own life and in the larger movement against the forms of abuse and exploitation they have endured and overcome. So again, we see the survivor-centered approach defined in reference to the GBV guiding principles, whereas here, a survival-led approach forefronts the idea of women's leadership and control, not just of their own lives, but of the fight against gender-based violence more broadly. And so we see a survivor-led approach as the logical consequence of embracing an intersectional feminist position that sees survivors as experts. And I'll hand back to Ken now for our very final thoughts. Next slide.
Thank you. So just a few final thoughts to conclude. With this work, our intention is not to criticize or undermine the life-saving work that GBV humanitarian practitioners do every day, and we're not seeking to chastise the GBV experts who wrote the guidance and continue to kind of write and roll out and build capacity on them. We're recognizing, obviously, that the GBV sector remains severely underfunded and undersupported, and that GBV services are not prioritized in humanitarian responses, even though they should be, and because they are life-saving. We recognize that those services are life-saving, even when they follow the models that we've described, which are not, in our reading, truly survivor-centered. Our contribution, however, is sort of situated within ongoing conversations that GBV actors have, and that humanitarian workers and actors are having about feminist and intersectional feminist approaches to this work, including the need to decolonize and localize humanitarian action. We think that the process of translation from feminist practice to humanitarian program implementation, that the survivor-centered approach has been distorted to fit in with narratives that place women and girls, among other survivors, in more of a passive position as passive recipients of services, rather than conscious political actors, which was the sort of origin of this concept and approach. And by revealing the gaps between the stated intention and the practice and application of the survivor-centered approach, we're hoping to encourage humanitarian GBV practitioners to recommit to the practice of trusting survivors and their expertise, to doing the work of letting go of power on the hand of the humanitarian actors, and respecting the power of the survivors themselves. And ultimately, we really encourage all of us to see the survivor-centered approach as a pathway towards a more just and more effective survivor-led approach to this work. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ilaria and Hen. There weren't any questions for clarification. Everyone in the audience, you'll have, this is not the last time you get to talk to Ilaria and Hen, so we're going to open it up after this. But in the interest of time, I'm now going to pass it over to Beth. So Beth.
Hi there. I welcome this conversation. I will try to not repeat what Ilaria and Hen have just shared with you, but I thought it would be useful in this discussion to talk a little bit about how we got here in the first place. I can say that it really helps me if I understand the underpinnings of an endeavor that I'm involved in. And I think it's useful to understand what was happening when this idea of survivor-centered approach and guiding principles was first started. Next slide, please. You're going to have a handout that we will provide after the webinar for all who registered. And we've come up with a 3-page sort of timeline to try to identify the global milestones that we could identify in shorthand speak that kind of led to where we are now with prevention and response to GBV and emergencies. And you see on this slide in the orange highlight, in the 1990s, so it was about 1989, 1990, 91, there were some funds available in UNHCR, and the money was used to start multi-sectoral GBV programming in 5 countries in East and West Africa. And this is, at the time, there was no such thing as the cluster system. And this was all happening within refugee contexts and largely led by UNHCR and its implementing partners and the communities it was working with. Next slide, please. So from 1999 to 2000 in Tanzania, Kenya, Liberia, and Guinea, the way we started was we brought together multi-sectoral teams. These were local partners. To some extent, they were refugee leaders, refugee women leaders, and NGOs in the various sectors that we've now come to identify as the multi-sectoral model. We brought people together for like a 2, 3, 4-day workshop, depending how many people. And we started with what is gender-based violence and those key concepts of what's violence, what's coercion, what's all of this. And we brought in people who could speak to the various types of GBV that were occurring in the setting and what the responses to those were and how the community was perceiving those responses and perceiving their risks. So we wanted people by the end of the workshop to understand what the potential after effects of gender-based violence were and what the causes and contributing factors kind of globally, societally, as well as specifically in the setting, so that they could understand that everybody has a role and a responsibility. Because prior to now, not all protection officers, for example, knew that this was an issue that they needed to focus on. And I didn't highlight in the previous slide, but all of this was growing out of the reproductive health services movement and the growth in reproductive health in humanitarian settings, which is also rooted in social justice and feminism movements. So anyway, back to where we are in this slide. in these countries, as part of the training, we would get the group to a place where basically we would say, so based on what you now understand about all these different forms of gender-based violence, what's causing them, what's contributing to them, and what the potential after effects and consequences might be. What do we need to be doing when we are dealing with survivors and with their families? What does our approach need to be? What are some guiding principles that should guide this work for all actors, all sectors, whether they be a UN agency, an NGO, community, volunteer, whatever. And these three guiding principles that we're all so familiar with now kind of emerged from that, and that was the importance of confidentiality, the importance of safety and security, and respect for the agency, the self-determination, and the choices of the individual survivor. Now, how exactly every sector would implement each of those guiding principles was slightly different, because if you're police or if you're court, confidentiality is not necessarily something that you can maintain over time, depending on the situation. But people were left with those guiding principles with the idea that each sector would have to determine, as they came up with their strategies and plans for programming, that they would have to incorporate those guiding principles into their work. And again, I want to emphasize that there was money for this. It was very popular. Everybody wanted to be part of this because suddenly there was money and somebody cared about sexual violence. Somebody cared about various forms of GBV. And there was money behind it. Next slide. So then we made all these attempts to try to make infographics when nobody was very good at infographics and we didn't have access to the great, clever, smart communications people. If we could have made this in 3D, I think it would have been a whole lot better. But this is one of the early kind of depictions of what we were trying to do, which is the refugee community was supposed to be at the center of all of it. There is a coordination function. There's also all these other actors. It's not just the direct clinical person or the doctor or the police officer. It was all these other people that needed to also be aware and involved in what was going on. And then these at the time were the sectors as laid out in UNHCR. At the time, they called it community services. And that was the whole psychosocial, which was also not necessarily well-defined for a very long time, but it included economic empowerment and other things like that. Legal services and legal justice services, security services, and healthcare. Next slide. So we'll provide you with these also. Hopefully some of you have seen these before. The book on the left is it's a training and planning workshop. It was the original one put out by UNHCR that reflected the experiences in those 5 countries, trying to sort of draw from what we learned while we were doing this, of how to get this very diverse audience to come together and talk about something that not necessarily everybody actually wanted to talk about, and then come up with a plan for their sector and a plan for coordination across, among, and between sectors. Now, based on these experiences in those 5 countries and implementing the program for about a little bit more than a year, there was a conference, which is the book in the center. This is conference proceedings from a lessons learned workshop that was held basically at the close of this Ted Turner money, the UNHCR funding for these projects in East and West Africa. Now, interestingly, in this book, it doesn't describe in minute detail the multi-sectoral model. It gives an overview of what it is. But at the conference, what we did was we brought in people from different sectors. There was somebody from the Kenya police there. There was somebody from representing several different groups of refugee women. There were health officers talking, and they were talking about what went right and what went wrong and kind of what they learned. And at this point in time, it really was about coordination and lack of coordination and how the coordination function should happen, who it should be, and how those guiding principles, in particular the confidentiality one, can be put into place when you're trying to coordinate among and between different sectors. Then the third book on the right is another training manual that came out in 2004 that was related to taking multisectoral groups, or really any group, and bringing people together who didn't really know much about gender-based violence in humanitarian settings, teaching them, and hopefully by the end, having them go outward to develop plans and take it further. Next slide, please. So then there we are in the 2000s. There was this huge growth in what we call now GBV programming. And the norm was that it was all terribly underfunded. And as a result, there was really not enough training and there was not enough supervision. You had maybe one social worker type person covering these vast geographic areas where the roads were bad and it was difficult to move between things. And GBV staff or counselors or community workers or something like that were hired. We didn't have kind of universal high quality training. Everybody was making up their own trainings, and supervision was not necessarily well understood and certainly wasn't well paid for. We had some terrible things happen as a result of this, and then a lot of us just got scared. So in one setting, there were some GBV staff who had been working on intimate partner violence and domestic violence, and working with the survivors to try to support them in making whatever decision they wanted to make about what they wanted to do with their marriage. And it was known in the community that the GBV staff were helping these survivors and were not necessarily helping the husband, the abusive husband. One night, a section of camp where several of the GBV staff lived, their huts were set on fire. And nobody died, but people certainly got burned and got hurt from it. It was also happened in a couple of other settings that there was some backlash against the GBV staff for helping survivors and not necessarily doing what the perpetrator wanted them to do, or how the community viewed this particular type of GBV should be dealt with. And when you have people who are working on that kind of in isolation, and they do not have, a whole host of expertise and readings and internet right there sitting on their shoulder with evidence about why we do it this way, and there's not enough supervision to provide for that, people can get hurt in this line of work. And I think that there was a little bit of a kind of like fright and overemphasis for a while on this issue of security and safety. Based on all of that, we've continued to move on, and everybody acknowledged that there was a need for standards and for training. So many things have been developed since then. We've already talked about them, the minimum standards, not the least of which. So that is your overview of how we got here. And I will hand it off to the next person. And I see Sarah. Well, that's not it. This is the last slide. I wanted to just show you, I don't know how many of you are aware of the e-learning that UNFPA has online for managing gender-based violence in emergencies. This is the companion guide. And I drew out just a picture from that I want to highlight for everybody. It posits that the approach, that the way to look at gender-based violence is through an ecological framework, which looks at the individual, the community, and the society. So that if we understand GBV in that ecological framework, then we can understand prevention and response within that same framework. Now, when this book was being written, for those of you that write things and try to provide guidance about things, I can remember so many teleconferences where we'd say, now, is it an approach or is it a framework? I don't know. Is it a framework or is it an approach? Is it the roots of the tree or is it the branches of the tree? Which is it? So what we came up with was it's the ecological framework, and then we have rights-based approaches, community-based approach, and the survivor-centered approach. All of those approaches happen within this broader context of understanding GBV through an ecological framework. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Clarissa, I would invite you to turn on your camera. I turned it off for you earlier and hand it over to
I
you.
can't. It says I cannot open my camera because you stopped my camera.
Okay, well, I'll see what I could do. Go right ahead.
Okay.
Please feel free to.
It's working now, right? Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone. I think it's super nice to invite a mixed of academic and practitioner in this discussion. So I'm Clarisse Roberto Guro, and I'm working at the Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation. Next slide, please. And before we go into the survivor-centered approach, I just want to quickly show what is our theory of change at the Mukwege Foundation, because it's kind of also explaining how we work with survivors. So the change we want to see is to break the silence around sexual violence as a weapon of war, and to change the collective response to sexual violence in times of conflict. We also want that the sexual violence is recognized as a crime with serious consequences. And how we see this happening is to support survivors to have access to holistic quality care, then to support survivor-led activism for solidarity and recognition and to end stigma, and then through justice and accountability. And at the end, what it looks like is that the survivors would have access to dignified quality care. They would have safe space to reclaim their powers. They will speak openly about sexual violence and claim their rights. There will be some survivor-centered accountability mechanism in place, and states and individuals will be held accountable to sexual violence crimes. And all of this, all of the work we do is according to a survivor-centered approach, which means for us that survivors themselves define their needs and solutions. And next slide, please. So for us, it's an approach that seeks to empower survivors by prioritizing their rights, their need, and their choice. And it's rooted in compassionate care. So we talk a bit already on some principles, but for us as Mukwege Foundation, it's very important to remind that it's the values are respect, non-discrimination. Yeah, sorry, I will slow down a bit. Non-discrimination, confidentiality, security, informed consent, and autodetermination of survivors. And for us, it means that survivors should participate at everything that could affect their life, which means like any project that we are doing, or also in all the prevention and response to SGBV and CRASV, which means that involving survivors also in clusters, in GBV committees, etc. And our work is guided by the slogan of SEMA. SEMA is the Global Network of Victims and Survivors to End Wartime Sexual Violence, which is nothing about us without us. And I see that Tatiana is one of the participants, so she can talk a bit more about SEMA after the discussion. Next slide, please. Then why to take this approach in practice? We consider that it gives a more effective and relevant humanitarian program, but also better documentation. Survivors know better than anyone else what they need and what works for them. So for us, they need to be consulted at before any project or any activities to understand the needs and the expectation of the survivors. It also helps to mitigate the expectation of other survivors. So at need assessment and project designs steps. Then during all the projects and activities we are conducting to ensure the well-being and the safety of survivors during the implementation, but also all the coordination, so which means like steering committees or any coordination activities that you have during the project. And of course, after the project, during the evaluation, it's so important to involve survivors to actually lead evaluation and accountability activities. And so this allows also to have to avoid any theoretical discussions on survivors. Next slide, please. So this, the small draw or like schema is actually the Panzis model. So the Panzi model is the model that was developed by Dr. Mukwege and his team in Congo. So we try as much as possible to roll out this model in other contexts. And the idea is to support survivors it starts from victims, and then they can have access to holistic care and become survivors. And then through support to network building, survivors-led networks, they can become agents of change and activists. And the terminology victims is also like, for example, in Colombia, we know that survivors prefer to be called sometimes victims because it has this legal connotation. So it's of course depending on each victim and survivors to decide on how they want to be called. And also many survivors, they want to get involved in the fight against SGBV because it gives meaning, purpose, and again, they know better than anyone else what is best for them. Next slide, please. Then it does a big impact in the referral systems and the referral pathway, because of course it's easier for a victim to talk to another survivor or from a survivors to another survivors. It avoids any problem of stigmatization, shame. It's easier trust, and it brings also a sense of sisterhood and solidarities. And also in general, survivor and especially survivor-led networks, they are very well connected in the communities. So they have access to areas that no other NGOs or any other stakeholders have access. So it allows also to access victims and survivors in areas that no one has access. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, for also, especially on the advocacy and sensitization aspect of the work, the voices of survivors are powerful. It's not the same as if it's a human rights defenders or activist or any practitioner, researchers that is talking about the topic, about sexual violence. It's the survivors themselves saying what's happened to them. So it actually prevents the public or the audience to question it or like to act as if it didn't happen, because the survivors is actually telling what's happened to her or to him. So it's a subject that is harder to ignore. And again, they are experts in their own field, so they are the best one to advocate for themselves. And this approach has been proven with some UN resolutions, so the 1325, that will be 25 years actually next year, and the 2467 UN resolution. Next slide, please. Okay, I will pass quickly on that, on how to adopt a survivor-centered approach in practice. So first, it encompasses the security, so to avoid any physical, psychological suffering, and recognize also that survivors know better than anyone else what they need. So even if you have some security expert at the end, you know, they are the one that knows that when their life is in danger also. The informed consent, so of course to explain to them what they are signing, what they are engaging themselves for. So it goes beyond just saying yes. And then autodetermination, which allows survivors to make an informed choice by giving all the information they want and to respect their choice, and to not influence the person by expressing our own personal feelings, because we shouldn't think instead of them. Next slide, please. Then another one is to have respectful attitude, respect everyone's choice, do not blame the survivors. But I will next slide, because maybe it's no time to go much into detail on that. Next slide again. Next slide again. Yes, so some of the challenging we faced at the Mukwege Foundation on having a survivor-centered approach is there is sometimes different level of education with the networks we are working. So what is very important is to identify the strengths of everyone, to strengthen their skills, and also to be super mindful of the language barrier and to provide a proper interpretation. Another challenge is the risk of stigma and safety for survivors, because when they really start to speak out, also their life can be really in danger. So to obtain always informed consent, to provide safety training, and different level of possible commitment according to what survivors wants to commit to. Then there is the risk of secondary trauma, because especially when they are activists, and they will talk better than me after, Miriam will explain more, but all their work is actually around their trauma. So it's very important to provide as much as possible psychological support when it's possible, and to give training on mental well-being. And then another challenge is limited time and financial means. So that's why it's important to compensate the time for survivors when they spend times on conferences, on any type of work. Like their work is work, so it shouldn't be just voluntary work. And always to budget survivors' participation. Next slide, please. And from survivor-centeredness to survivor-led activism. So here, we at Mukwege Foundation, we are supporting survivor-led networks. So there is this global network, SEMA, that Tatiana can also explain a bit quickly after. And then we are supporting a national survivors network, in terms of capacity building, governance, functioning cost, etc., so that they can grow and that they can themselves become a real interlocutor and real actors in the GBV response and preventions, not just, person that they invite sometimes, but that they actually lead the work on the prevention and response against conflict-related sexual violence. Next slide, please. And why a survivor-led approach is crucial into the prevention and response to GBV. So this is actually quite the same arguments as the why a survivor-centered approach is important. It's like a more efficient and relevant documentation and assistance programs. It increases the quality of care for survivors, since they are in the they are leading and they are explaining and saying what is needed for survivors. It increases the quality. It's increasing the sustainability of programs and policies. It empowers survivors to facilitate access to victims. Also, their messages are stronger, and it makes it harder to ignore the subject of conflict-related sexual violence. And their strong voice have the power to cut through deep-rooted taboos, stigmas, and indifference. And that's why we really promote as much as possible, also among all the audience here, like as much as possible, please invite survivors and involve survivor-led networks, survivor-led movements when you talk about survivors. Next slide, please. And last slide, I think. Yeah, and the challenges for us as Mukwege Foundation on ensuring this kind of approach is the lack of support and consideration for survivors themselves. Sometimes they are used as a token. We see it because in some of the events they are invited sometimes. Yeah, it's going with the next point. Like there is no planning, there is no visa organized for them, no hotel, no per diem, etc. So it's just like, we want to invite the survivors because we want to show that we have a survivor-centered approach, but actually nothing is really done to ensure that the survivors can really participate in a meaningful way to the event or the activity they are invited to. And again, the lack of compensation survivors' time, the language barrier. There are a lot of events where they are invited and then like 1 out of 3 days there is interpretation, but not the other day. So it's make it very complicated for them to be part of the discussion. And also the question of the informed consent, especially about photos and videos, that sometimes survivors are pushed to sign stuff that they actually do not understand. So I see Sarah coming. So so that's pretty much what we advocate for. And I will let the floor to Miriam after that.
Okay, while we switch over the slideshow to Miriam's slides, I will invite Miriam to introduce herself and to give her presentation. And Tatiana, if you would like to speak for a few minutes after that, we will unmute you as well. So Miriam, please.
Merci beaucoup, merci. Bonsoir à tout le monde. Et je pense qu'à la prochaine fois, je vais intervenir en anglais, je pense, pour que les gens puissent comprendre. Alors, je suis vraiment très contente et je remercie à Clarisse. Je suis Fal Myriam Djongala, Myriam, activiste et féministe centrafricaine. Je suis coordonnatrice de la plateforme Moussouka, une organisation qui est composée de 10 organisations de la société civile en République centrafricaine qui militent pour les droits des femmes, du viol sexuel lié au conflit armé, soutenue par la fondation du docteur Denis Mukwege. Je suis membre du réseau mondial des suivantes CEMA, qui est constitué de 29 pays aujourd'hui, dont la RCA aussi y figure. Je suis membre du comité d'action transformatrice des activistes internationales, ACT, de l'ONU Femmes, et lauréat du prix Simone Veil 2024 en France. Voilà ce que je peux présenter. Merci beaucoup. Vous me suivez?
Oui, oui, on t'entend, vas-y, continue.
Oui. Alors, Mosuka, aujourd'hui, c'est une plateforme qui est constituée de 10 organisations et Mosuka a 700 membres aujourd'hui. Mosuka est représenté dans les 10 arrondissements de Bangui, y compris les 16 préfectures de Bangui, à travers nos points focaux qui travaillent dans les 20 préfectures. Si aujourd'hui, un partenaire veut peut-être descendre dans les locaux, peut-être en province pour travailler, on va contacter juste nos points focaux pour qu'ils puissent aller travailler avec ces points focaux directement. Et aussi dans les arrondissements au niveau de Bangui, Mosuka travaille à travers les relais communautaires. S'il y a les informations, ce sont ces relais communautaires-là qui nous informent à travers les informations. Quand il y a les suivants du viol, on les identifie et on les réfère. Et aussi, Mosuka, son plan d'action est de faire la sensibilisation et l'identification des suivants du viol sexuel lié au conflit armé et le référencement. C'est-à-dire quand on identifie la personne qui est suivant du viol, on fait maintenant le référencement pour les soins holistiques dans les services qui est concerné pour qu'on puisse prendre en charge ces suivantes-là. Et aujourd'hui, Mosuka fait le plaidoyer pour l'implication des suivants dans tous les processus de la paix. Et aujourd'hui, à travers le plaidoyer de Mosuka, nous sommes représentés au niveau du gouvernement dans le comité stratégique. Ça veut dire que le gouvernement a entendu notre voix aujourd'hui et nous a impliqués dans tous les processus de la paix. Et aussi, Mosuka fait la formation pour que les suivantes puissent avoir leur autonomisation. Et aussi, Mosuka développe des AGR pour que l'autonomisation des suivantes puisse avoir un impact sur elles-mêmes. Et aussi, nous développons les AGR à travers les approches centrées sur les suivantes. C'est là que les suivantes aient une autonomisation pour qu'elles puissent être autonomisées et travailler dans ce sens envers leur père. Mosuka aussi développe, Mosuka partage les kits de dignité aux plus démunis de notre organisation. Et aussi à travers le prix Simone Veil, Mosuka est très reconnu aujourd'hui sur le plan international. À travers le prix Simone Veil que Mosuka a reçu, je pense que Mosuka travaille sur le plan international aussi avec d'autres organisations, d'autres partenaires qui aiment aussi bénéficier de l'expérience de Mosuka. Car Mosuka aujourd'hui a passé 6 ans en matière de travailler sur les violences sexuelles, sur le terrain. Ses expériences ont démontré d'amener les suivantes à briser le silence et aussi à être capables de développer leur propre AGR sur le terrain. Et en collaboration avec la fondation du docteur Denis Mukwege qui nous a vraiment aidés, qui nous a vraiment soutenus aujourd'hui à briser le silence. Et nous sommes convaincus que la fondation du docteur Denis Mukwege vraiment nous a vraiment aidés dans ce sens pour qu'on puisse être autonomisé aujourd'hui. Et je pense que Mosuka travaille en collaboration avec d'autres partenaires ainsi que aussi la Fondation Mukwege pour l'avancement, pour le développement des AGR. Voilà ce que je peux dire et je reste serein s'il y a des questions pour que je puisse répondre.
Thank you so much. And then I would just like to ask Tatiana if you would like to unmute yourself. We didn't announce Tatiana because we weren't able to confirm when we sent out the invitation, but we're so thrilled that she joined. So Tatiana, please.
En fait, je n'ai pas fait de présentation, mais je vais devoir essayer de faire une synthèse de tout ce que je pouvais dire. Je vais me présenter, je suis Tatiana Moukanire. Je suis coordinatrice nationale du mouvement des survivants de violences sexuelles en République démocratique du Congo. Je suis membre fondatrice de CEMA, des réseaux mondiaux de survivantes. J'ai sorti mon premier livre, Au-delà de nos larmes, en 2021. C'est un livre qui réunit deux histoires, mon histoire personnelle et les histoires de toutes les victimes de violences sexuelles en RDC. Aujourd'hui, je suis membre du conseil d'administration de FONAREV, le Fonds national de réparation pour les victimes de crimes graves en RDC. En fait, pour moi, je pense que je vais plus parler de l'approche centrée sur le survivant et les victimes, parce que chez nous, chez SEMA, on a tendance de parler de victimes et survivantes selon que les personnes font le choix d'être appelées telles qu'ils veulent. La première question qui m'a été posée, c'était de savoir qui connaît mieux la survivante ou le prestataire de services. Et à un moment donné, je me dis que personne ne pourrait remplacer l'autre. Les survivantes ne viennent pas remplacer les prestataires de services. Cependant, les survivantes connaissent mieux parce qu'en fait, ce problème, ils l'ont vécu dans leur chair, ils l'ont vécu dans leurs âmes et ils connaissent mieux de quoi ils ont besoin que quiconque, en fait. Et c'est pourquoi il faut vraiment le mettre au centre de tout pour qu'on ne puisse pas avoir plus de dérapages ou d'incompréhensions dans l'avenir. L'autre chose, c'était que le victime, le survivant ont besoin que les cadres qu'ils ont créés, par exemple SEMA, par exemple les réseaux de victimes qui existent dans plusieurs pays dans le monde, par exemple en Ukraine, en RDC, partout, soient soutenus au fait pour essayer de porter encore plus de voix, donner plus d'espace pour libérer la parole et suivre en fait le processus de guérison. Parce que quand on donne un espace aux victimes, quand on donne l'espace aux survivantes, on les aide à suivre leur processus de guérison. Et en même temps, c'est le moment que la peur change de camp. Toute cette personne, ce bourreau qui vous amenait à vous perdre dans votre peur, vous ramènent, deviennent, eux, ils ont plus peur que vous à ce moment-là parce qu'ils se rendent compte que vous avez libéré la parole. Ils se rendent compte que ils sont en train de perdre leur force. Et la dernière question pour moi, ou la dernière préoccupation, je dirais que il faudrait qu'au tout début, dans une approche centrée sur les survivantes, moi, je ne les dirais pas comme étant une approche dirigée par les survivantes, parce que, en fait, les capacités se diffèrent et aussi, à un moment donné, on se rend compte que nous, en tant que victimes, en tant que survivantes, la majorité, nous sommes analphabètes, mais nous avons besoin d'espace. Et au tout début, je me dis qu'il y a un besoin d'écouter les survivantes. C'est un besoin énorme parce que c'est à partir de cette écoute que l'on peut comprendre de quoi on a besoin et comment on peut orienter des projets. Que pour ce qui est de projets, parce que deux fois, ce sont des projets qui viennent, mais qui ne répondent pas aux besoins de survivantes parce que on n'a pas pu écouter les survivantes en amont. De l'autre côté, après cela, il faudrait placer et aider cette survivante à montrer ses capacités. C'est qu'on peut, à un moment donné, moi, je travaillais en tant qu'assistante psychosociale parce que je soutenais d'autres survivantes. Et ce qui est vrai est que toutes les survivantes, quand elles arrivaient, elles avaient plus besoin de me parler en tant que survivante parce qu'ils avaient confiance en moi, parce qu'ils se disaient qu'elle ne va pas nous juger. Et je fais pendant 5 ans, je travaillais en tant qu'assistante psychosociale. Désolée, il y a coupure du courant. Je travaillais en tant qu'assistante sociale pour aider d'autres survivants, d'autres victimes à commencer comme moi je le fais, leur processus de guérison. Et à la fin, leur donner le pouvoir. Aujourd'hui, je peux me considérer comme étant une actrice de changement. Je peux me considérer comme étant quelqu'un qui contribue au développement de ma communauté parce que je suis passée par ce processus. Je puis trouver de personnes qui m'ont entendu. J'ai rencontré le docteur Mukwege, j'ai rencontré d'autres personnes qui ont pu me donner le temps de montrer la capacité que j'avais. Et ça a aidé à ce qu'aujourd'hui, je soutienne d'autres victimes. Nous avons un réseau qui a plus de 5000 membres en RDC et c'est un réseau qui soutient toutes les victimes aujourd'hui déplacées de guerre dans notre pays ou qui sont dans d'autres pays à l'extérieur qui ont besoin de notre soutien. Je pense que tout ce qu'on veut, c'est avoir de victimes qui passent de l'état de victime, actrices de changement, à leaders dans leur communauté, mais en même temps, en personnes qui contribuent au développement de la paix. Ça veut dire qu'il faut les impliquer à tout le niveau. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, and we're so happy that you were able to join us.
Allô?
We have a lot of questions in the chat and also some questions to pose to you. So I'd ask all the panelists if they could turn on their cameras so that we can hear you talk. So my first question to all of you is, how, in your opinion, can organizations and frontline practitioners ensure that they're truly listening and letting survivors lead their healing processes, especially what we see in an emergency, fast-paced context? Any thoughts there?
Pardon, si vous pouvez répéter la question?
Sure. How can GBV organizations and service providers make sure that they are truly listening and letting survivors lead, especially when it's an emergency, fast-paced context?
Je pense que pour entendre les victimes à travers leur voix, c'est donner l'opportunité à la formation, par exemple, pour que la suivante puisse briser le silence. Puisque, par exemple, moi aujourd'hui, c'est parce que j'ai brisé le silence que je suis là parmi vous pour parler de mes expériences. Et que si aussi aujourd'hui la fondation ne m'a pas amené à briser le silence, je ne pouvais pas être là aujourd'hui à parler de mon histoire. Donc, en tout cas, il faudrait donner l'opportunité à travers les renforcements des capacités, les formations, pour que la suivante puisse être autonome de parler de son histoire. Parce que si aujourd'hui elle se lève pour parler de son histoire, ça veut dire elle a la capacité de tout, elle a déjà une formation derrière elle, elle est garantie à toute sécurité pour qu'elle puisse parler de son histoire devant les gens. Parce que si elle ne reçoit pas les formations, tout ça, là, la suivante va dire que, mais ben, comme elle n'a pas reçu la formation, comment parler devant les gens, comment briser le silence, elle va rester dans son état et c'est son état là qui va l'amener peut-être à être, peut-être à devenir, à ne pas devenir activiste. Aujourd'hui, je suis activiste parce que j'ai reçu des formations, j'ai passé par des étapes pour être activiste féministe aujourd'hui. Donnez-nous l'opportunité, donnez-nous la formation, donnez-nous les moyens pour qu'on puisse être capable de parler de nos histoires, de nos expériences, de partager avec les autres. C'est ce que je peux dire.
Thank you. And Tatiana, you have your hand up if you'd like to respond.
Et merci pour la question. En fait, moi, je suis d'accord avec Myriam. Et pour moi, je pense que tout devait commencer par l'écoute. Tout devait commencer par un espace où la personne a le temps de s'exprimer. Parce que on ne connaîtra jamais le besoin de quelqu'un si la personne n'arrive pas à s'exprimer. Je pense que c'est ça. Il faut qu'il y ait un début. Et pour moi, le début, c'est écouter la personne, le respecter et lui montrer qu'il a de la valeur dans la communauté.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Would anyone else like to respond to that? Beth?
I would just also in the context of some of the other comments and questions I saw in the chat. I think so many of these questions have everything to do with what is the role of the person? What is the expected role of the person who is interacting with the survivor in the context of the question that we're asking is to be sure that the role is clear. Is it a prosecutor? Is it an investigator? Is it a counselor? Is it an advocate? Is it a like a referral person, case manager person who's going to help them get to an array of different services? What is the role of that person? And what training and support are in place in order for them to be successful in that role in all the different ways that we have come to define success in a survivor-led or survivor-centered approach.
Anybody else like to add?
Bon, je pense sur cette question. Allô, je peux? Allô, je peux?
Vas-y.
Oui,
Yes, please,
je
please.
pense, je pense que sur cette question, quand la personne a reçu des viols sexuels liés au conflit, etc., la première chose, c'est d'abord avoir un état psychologique. Parce que moralement, on se dit, on est déjà mort dans notre corps. Je prends mon cas. Quand j'ai vécu les moments horribles de ma vie, je me suis dit, mais ça vaut plus la peine de rester en vie. J'avais même l'intention de me suicider. Et les APS, en tout cas, ce sont les gens qui devaient vraiment aider les survivants à briser leur silence, à accepter leur état pour devenir les activistes. Et je me souviens que il faudrait donner aussi les moyens à ces APS-là, parce que si la personne n'est pas vraiment formée, elle ne peut pas vraiment, ou bien la personne, il ne peut pas vraiment aider la survivante à surmonter dans son état. Je vous donne un exemple. Quand j'étais arrivée à l'hôpital, j'étais dans une situation où je ne pouvais pas, mais l'APS a fait que moi-même, je suis tombée dans un état où je me suis retrouvée à la psychiatrie. J'ai fait une dépression pendant 2 mois parce que l'APS n'était pas vraiment disponible pour m'écouter. L'APS n'avait pas pris son temps pour m'écouter, à savoir ce qui s'est passé réellement pour m'aider. Donc, en tout cas, c'est vraiment très, très important que si une survivante a reçu des coups, une survivante qui a déjà vécu des choses horribles dans ta vie, en tout cas, la première chose déjà, c'est l'aspect mental. C'est l'aspect mental. Il faudrait d'abord sauver la personne d'une manière générale de l'aspect mental avant maintenant de descendre sur le plan gynécologique, etc. Parce que dorénavant, sa morale est déjà abattue. Et elle peut penser à n'importe qui, à n'importe comment. Et pour la sauver, il faudrait déjà faire un besoin et d'avoir maintenant ses idées, comment on peut l'orienter. Est-ce que la personne a besoin d'une orientation mentale, peut-être d'une orientation médicale, d'une orientation peut-être juridique? Il faudrait savoir ça d'abord pour qu'on puisse planifier et savoir qu'est-ce que la survivante a besoin pour faire l'orientation. Parce que si on ne sait pas ce que la survivante a besoin pour faire son orientation, ça devient difficile. Et ce qui fait que souvent les survivantes se retrouvent dans les états où elles-mêmes ne peuvent pas supporter. Donc la première chose, c'est l'état psychologique.
Thank you so much. Clarice, you had your hand raised?
Yes, merci Myriam, and just to answer also to your first question on how for like practitioner, researcher to ensure that you hear survivors, I advise that in every context you work with, like look for survivors, look for survivor-led movements, survivor-led networks. I put the link also on the SEMA Global Network that you can be in touch so that when you start any kind of activities or any kind of research, you consult with them. You know, that's the basic and the best practice to get. And also, I just want to say something because this is a practical example that is also showing a bit sometimes the how to say the gap between the academic and the practice is like we were at the SVRI forum like 2 weeks ago. And there was Leah, so she's the colleague of Miriam, also a network leader of Mosuka. We had another survivor leader, Esperand, and we saw a lot of very interesting research where all of them were saying, yeah, we had a survivor-centered approach, we consulted with survivors, etc. But none of these researchers invited a survivor to this conference, for example, to present the work, to present the finding. So this is the basic, you know, like you consulted survivors for all this process. You actually used, I'm sorry, but this is like as it is, you use survivors in your research, but then, you know, there is no any accountability towards it. In many cases, also those kind of reports, they are not even sent to survivors, you know, and that's, or it's something that we consider it's not accessible for them. Also make it accessible. Do a workshop, do a consultation, do a focus group discussion with them, explaining that, okay, you participate to this thing, and this is what we get as a finding. And the next step is how we're going to use this research in practice and how this research is going to be useful for your practice and for you as a survivors, you know. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you for that, Clarice. I wanted to combine two questions that were asked in the group here. One is Didem. She announced that she's a bit concerned that it might we might go the other way and it become a type of a prerequisite for survivors to participate in the community engagement or speaking out when many of them don't feel ready to. And what do you all think of that? And then also Alina asked the question that, in fact, many of the people who work in GBV service provision are themselves survivors. And we find a way that we're survivors trying to help other survivors. So what are your thoughts there on this kind of division that we've created here? Anyone? Ilaria.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from the perspective like of how we had these discussions while we were writing the article, but then if there are more thoughts, you know, broader thoughts, I think would be great to hear from others. So we did absolutely, I really loved Didim's question because we did actually have this discussion as we were writing the article, and we do say in the article that we want to be very clear that when we say give voice to survivors or, you know, survivors should lead this process, we're not saying, we're not calling for survivorhood to become a prerequisite or something that you have to declare in order to be involved in activities or be an activist, etc. Like we absolutely you know, respect women's choice around whether they do want to talk as survivors or not, and to leverage the, you know, whatever part of their experience that they want to leverage in the work that they want to do. And I also, if I understood the question correctly, want to make it clear that we make it very clear that there is no expectation that survivors must be involved in activism or that survivors want to be involved in activism. In the article, we make a we talk about Brittany Cooper's distinction between like neoliberal empowerment as like giving women the opportunity to go to a health service or start their own business versus empowerment as having the power to challenge the systems of oppression that affect us. And, you know, what we're saying is we want to see this other kind of empowerment, if we like the language of empowerment, or we can use this other opportunity and choice being given to women to engage in all aspects of GBV of the fight against GBV, or choose not to, because they might absolutely never want to think about that again. That's absolutely fine. But there needs to be the opportunity, and exactly everything that Miriam was saying around the support and the training needs to be available there. So if that women want to engage, they should. I'm conscious of the time, so I have responded to Lena in the chat. I will just say that in terms of, like, we acknowledge and really obviously are aware of how many survivors are involved in the sector. However, in my personal experience as a GBV practitioner and as a researcher in my research as well, I found that it's very rare that a practitioner will be able to, or will feel comfortable speaking about their experiences of surviving violence, and to bring that experience to the room, especially when it comes to maybe challenging certain rules or certain principles or certain ways that an organization works. And I think then that is further, of course, complicated by other power structure. So maybe a white European survivor might feel comfortable doing that in a room, but their African local staff colleague might not feel so comfortable doing so when someone is saying mediation is absolutely forbidden and we don't do that. And I, as a white European woman, I have done that. I have shut down my colleagues who were saying, this is important to us, and I have shut them down, and I fully regret that now. So I think that is where I see that there is a nice discourse that we have about many of us are survivors, but I haven't found in my 15 years of experience that we're actually having conversations as survivors when we're designing GBV guidelines, or where we are creating trainings.
Thank you, Ilaria. I'm going to call on Tatiana, then Hen, and I just want to apologize to Tatiana and Miriam that we can't spotlight you in the video because your cameras are off, and we're trying in the technical side. But anyway, Tatiana, then Hen.
Oui, en fait, je voulais juste rajouter quelque chose. Je pense que les survivantes, il faudra à un moment donné qu'on ne puisse pas le séparer de l'humain qu'il est. Et qu'à un moment donné, il faudrait prendre cette personne dans sa globalité, en sachant que toutes les servantes ne répondent pas de la même manière. Je peux pouvoir m'en sortir, je peux pouvoir vivre avec ma douleur, mais une autre personne n'y arrive pas. Je pense qu'il faut prendre le temps pour tout le monde. Il faut voir, en fait, je pense qu'il est temps de voir comment orienter les gens selon leurs capacités. Certains n'arrivent pas à sortir leur douleur, d'autres arrivent à les sortir et à soutenir les autres victimes, ceux qui continuent à être victimes. Et je pense que c'est vraiment que, pour moi, je pense qu'il faudrait à un moment donné, parce que je le vois même dans mon pays, quand on parle de survivantes ou de victimes, les gens te regardent différemment. C'est une partie de discrimination, mais je pense que c'est important qu'on nous voit en tant qu'humains, pas en tant que personnes différentes.
Thank you so much. Hen.
Yeah, and just to briefly support what Tatiana has just I think said, and to just elaborate a little bit more, that even if what I think Alina's comment implies, I'm not sure if that's what it was intended to imply, that there's already a certain level of survivor-led aspects within the existing system as we've described it. That to also, consider that these are things that were developed by people with specific experiences, specific capacities, and specific approaches for dealing with with their own experiences, right? And that that does not necessarily mean that what is being offered is sufficient or a full match to what a survivor might want in a specific context, right? So we're trying to kind of shift again, suggest a reshifting of the focus to what individual survivors in a given context might prioritize, want, need, as support to be able to both work through their experiences, heal, but also to give them opportunities beyond the sort of approach that is applied in a range of settings. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you all who were able to stay the additional 15 minutes. We're going to launch this poll now. Shiva, if you could do it. I just want to let you all know that all of the chat and all the questions, Hannah and Ilaria have asked for a copy of them because they want to get back to you on your answers. We will share with you all of the resources that were shared in the chat. Most of you are members of the community of practice, and we can continue this conversation over there. There's a lot of good things that are coming up out of this and a lot of ways that we can share and move this discussion further. In the meantime, I'd like to thank all of the speakers, Hannah and Ilaria, for your wonderful article that started this, Beth, who I've always considered my mentor in the GBV field and who has written these materials that have gotten us to where we are, Tatiana and Mariam and Clarissa for coming together. Kind of at the last minute, we were scrambling around thanks to the SVRI dominating everyone's time, but thank you for coming and sharing your wonderful insight. Shiva and Valentina running the tech in the background, keeping us going, and most importantly, our interpreters who are here today, thanks to the GBV AOR, who got us the funding to bring them on board to allow us to have both the English and the French. And we always need you to make sure that we understand each other. So we're going to close now. I'd like to just thank you all again and remind you, if you'd like to join the COP, you can send us a message at the GBV AOR Community of Practice, gbvcop@gmail.com. We'll send you the information. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci, merci Clarisse.
Merci, Myriam. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you. It was quite interesting. My first time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll send you all the recordings and the PowerPoints so you have them all.
Thank you, Sarah.